Well, good evening and a very warm welcome from Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you might be in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, John Hilary, and I'll introduce John to you in just a moment. Some housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. And I'd like also to draw your attention to the chat facility. This is not for questions. This is if you want to send a message to the other participants on this webinar and type in whatever you'd like to say, and that will be circulated. Finally, we are recording this event and it will appear on our website at milim.org.uk in the next day or two. There you will find details of our future programme for which you can book tickets, as well as recordings of other past events that have taken place. And so to our guest this evening. John Hilary has published widely on global trade and other international issues throughout a career in the non-governmental sector, rising to become executive director of the charity War on Want before working in Parliament for the Labour Party. He's an honorary professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham and is the author of From Refugees to Royalty, the remarkable story of the Messel family of Nymans, as well as this book, Magnates and Masterpieces, the German Jewish collectors of Edwardian Britain, which he will be speaking to us about this evening. So without further ado, let me hand over. John, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and good evening, everybody. And I will now share my slides if that all goes well. And do let me know if by any chance they haven't appeared on your screen. I'm hoping that they're there now.
All good.
Fantastic. Yes, well, thank you so much for the invitation to be able to deliver this presentation this evening. I'm thrilled to be able to share this story more widely, the story of these German Jewish magnates who arrived in Britain, because really it was a labor of love putting this book together to find out about their stories and really to restore their reputation. Because at the time they came to Britain in the later 19th century and into the Edwardian era, they were really quite well known and they were celebrated for their philanthropy, for their cultural patronage. And yet they've fallen off the historical record. They've almost been erased from history in the 100 years since. And I'm going to come back at the end of the talk to ask why that might be the case. But basically, the book is the story of these 12 families, all of whom, as I say, came over to Britain from Germany in the latter part of Victoria's reign and really found their fullest expression in the Edwardian era, so the years leading up to the First World War. And they won public honours. Many of them were knighted, made baronets. And if you look in the right-hand column, second from the bottom, Sir Herbert Stern was actually elevated to the peerage. He was made Lord Michelham. So along the way, I'll be referring to Stern and Michelham interchangeably. So you must be aware that that's the same persons. And I thought to start with, really, I'd ask, well, who are these people, and why did they come from Germany? And maybe let's start with the fella on the front of the book, Sir Ernest Cassel, here in this rather nice portrait from 1907 by the Swedish artist Anders Zorn. Cassel came over, like a lot of the German Jews of that time, from a middle-class family. His family was from Cologne, and he arrived in Liverpool carrying a bag of clothes and a violin. And from that rather modest beginnings, he rose to be the most important financier in Europe in those early years of the 20th century. He rivaled the Rothschilds, even though he did it single-handedly. And also, particularly important for him, he became a very good friend of King Edward VII, both when he was Prince of Wales and after his accession. And everybody thought this was quite amusing because when they had their top hats on, Sir Ernest Cassel and the king looked very similar and would often be mistaken one for the other. Another of the very well-known figures of the time was Dr. Ludwig Mond, who you see here in this portrait by Solomon J. Solomon. And I think I'll just have a quick discursion to say Solomon J. Solomon was the second Jewish artist to be made a full member of the Royal Academy. And it's interesting with a lot of these portraits I'm showing you of the magnates and of their wives, they were made by outsiders. They were made by people who were not perhaps part of the traditional mainstream of British society. So these were German Jews who first generation come over as outsiders themselves, and they often chose outsiders to paint their portraits, either foreigners or, like Solomon J. Solomon, a Jewish man like themselves. And Dr. Mond, he was the founder of the chemical industry in Britain. His company eventually became ICI and was the largest manufacturer in Britain for most of the 20th century. And you see him here in the honorary doctorate robes of Oxford University just before his death. And even with these first two figures, Sir Ernest Cassel and Ludwig Mond, we can get the first beginnings of an answer as to why they came from Germany. In Cassel's case, he was a great financier, and London was the international centre of finance at that time. You know, Britain was the centre of a global empire and much further advanced in economic development, particularly in financial services, than Germany was. And Mond, Dr. Mond, he also gives a sense of why they wanted to leave Germany in the first place. Because even though at that time, in the latter part of the 19th century, Jews in Germany were beginning to enjoy their first political rights, civil rights on paper, in practice, it was a very different matter. And in fact, you found more and more careers were being blocked to German Jews as they got this emancipation in other fields. They found their ambitions, their aspirations in their professional lives often blocked. And with the rise of the overtly anti-Semitic parties in the 1880s and 1890s, there was a call for Jews to be removed more and more from public life. That type of situation really didn't pertain in Britain. There was a much more liberal atmosphere, and that's why a lot of the German Jews looked across to Britain and said, well, look, we're getting nowhere here in Germany. Let's try in the more liberal atmosphere across the Channel. The third particularly large group of the German Jews who I were looking at are exemplified by Alfred Beit, seen here in this portrait by Giovanni Boldini, again a foreign, in this case an Italian artist. And Alfred Beit was the most famous of the Randlords, as they were called. The Randlords were this group of adventurers who'd gone out to South Africa, first in the diamond fields of Kimberley and then the gold mines of the Rand. And they had made astonishing fortunes. I mean, these were the very richest men in the world. And they came back not to Germany, but to Britain, and they settled in London, and often they used their wealth to be merchant bankers or otherwise to be involved in the finance side of things. And Alfred Beit himself, he was very involved, as we will find out later, in the colonial program. He was a great friend of Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, and that led him into troubles, that led him into hot water. Um, Sir Karl Mayer, as he became, he was at the time of this painting, Mr. Karl Mayer, was portrayed here by Hubert Herkomer, Hubert von Herkomer, and he was actually headhunted by the Rothschilds. And the Rothschilds don't appear in my book so much because by the end of the 19th century, the English Rothschilds had already been here for 100 years, and so they were already in the third generation. So they didn't quite fit with the same story as these ones. But Rothschild Bank wanted to have a foreign correspondent clerk, and they were told by their contacts in Hamburg of this young man, Karl Mayer, who was widely spoken in lots of languages. He's had English, French, Spanish, Italian, as well as German. So they employed him, and he worked for 25 years for the Rothschilds in London. But what's particularly nice about this portrait of him is that, in fact, it's two portraits in one. Because if you see behind him on the wall, you've got the very celebrated portrait of his wife, Adele, and their two children, which is this one by John Singer Sargent, which caused a sensation when it was first shown at the Royal Academy in 1897, so just a year after it was painted, and is still one of the considered to be one of the greatest Sargent portraits that exists. But what was interesting here is that although everybody said it was a bravura performance in terms of its painterliness, some of the critics, the reviewers of the Royal Academy show when it was first displayed, remarked very strongly on how Jewish the sitters looked. So Henry James, the American novelist, who was a great friend of John Singer Sargent, he said it was extraordinary how Jewish not just the children looked with their dark hair, but also Adele Meyer, Mrs. Karlmeyer herself, even though we perhaps looking now wouldn't immediately identify that there was anything Jewish about her. Henry Strachey, another of the reviewers, wrote in The Spectator a much less flattering account of it. And he said, really, it makes them look unattractive and it's an over civilized Oriental feel to it. And I think this is important because it reminds us that even if there was a more liberal political and social atmosphere which allowed for German Jews to progress in their careers, there were still undercurrents of prejudice there. And of course, not just towards Jews in those days, but towards any type of foreigner and any type of new money. So the German Jews had a reception which was, on the one hand, favorable because they were able to make their way in the world in a way that they perhaps wouldn't have been able to in Germany itself. And on the other hand, they had to cope with the prejudices that still existed in Britain then. The last one of the ones I want to show from Sargent is of Matilda Hirsch, who was born Matilda Seligmann. And again, I'm afraid here I have to declare a certain personal interest because she is a remote cousin on my mother's side. Her grandfather was my great 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 grandfather back in Darmstadt in Germany. And this again was acclaimed as a wonderful work by Sargent when it was shown at the Royal Academy in 1902. And people thought that it was a great display of the dress, this pink and silver dress, which is taken from an original Velázquez painting. The only dissenting voice, the only reviewer who didn't like the painting, was for the Jewish Chronicle. And he said that he felt that the dress itself was singularly unbecoming, and therefore the painting wasn't such a great painting after all. I can only think that this is perhaps because it is a bit immodest and shows more of her chest and shoulders than a Jewish matron was supposed to show in that period. So much for who they were then. The next thing I wanted to just focus on is where they lived and the sorts of establishments they held, mainly in London, because that's where they gravitated towards, particularly the ones who were involved in finance. And this is the house in which Matilda Hirsch, who we've just seen, lived with her husband Leopold, their four children, their 12 domestic live-in servants, and a Swiss governess for the children. This is in Kensington Park Gardens, sorry, Kensington Palace Gardens, just to the west of Hyde Park, and what is now known as Billionaires Row. But perhaps even more grand in terms of its position is this house, 49 Belgrave Square, which was owned by Sir Otto Beit, the brother of Alfred Beit, who we saw earlier, and his wife Lillian. And the significance of this is that it was in the heart of aristocratic London. So Belgravia was really where the nobility lived, the traditional landed aristocracy. And in fact, this was previously the London townhouse of the Duke of Richmond. So very grand in itself, but also in a very grand area, which was quite an incursion for the first generation of these German Jewish immigrants. And you can see above the portico that flag is the Argentinian flag, because this today is the official residence of the Argentine ambassador to Britain. And what's rather wonderful is that the successive Argentine ambassadors have kept the interior of the building pretty much as the Beit family, Sir Otto Beit and his wife, had redesigned it when they moved in. So this is what would have been their ballroom back in the day, and it still has exactly the same decor and indeed the same tapestry at the far end of the room. And I was particularly lucky because the current Argentine ambassador allowed us to use that very room for the launch of my book at the back end of last year. So I have a very warm feeling towards this particular place. Another of the London residences still to be extant today, because a lot of them have been pulled down or converted in the meantime, is this one in Mayfair. And Mayfair, again, was one of the areas which was particularly favoured by these ultra rich magnates when they settled in London. And this was the house of Sir Edgar Speyer and his wife Leonora. And Speyer turned it into this fantasy world inside, with Gothic staircase on one side, a Renaissance staircase on the other, rooms which were filled with original ceilings and doorways and chimney pieces from Italy and France. And then this music room, which was created and still exists today as a 18th century French fantasy room with this trompe-l'oeil ceiling. And what was interesting about this, it's not just for showing off on the part of the Speyers, because they were both very cultured and highly musical individuals. Leonora Speyer, so Sir Edgar's wife, was a virtuoso violinist who'd played with Elgar and Grieg and others like that. And the Speyers used to hold concerts here for up to 200 people, with Richard Strauss playing, with Percy Grainger, with Edvard Grieg, and it was really a central part of that whole cultural social scene in London at the time. They also had country residences, and you could rent places, you could lease places across the country if you wanted to have shooting parties or you wanted to go stalking in Scotland. But one or two of them actually had their own places, including Strawberry Hill, which you may recognize if you've been to it. It was obviously Horace Walpole's house back in the 18th century, and it's now a museum really dedicated to him. But Lord Michelham, Sir Herbert Stern, inherited it from his father and would hold garden parties here for Conservative Party and other grandees to be able to travel down from London, because he was very big in the Conservative Party himself. If you couldn't find a house in the country that you liked, you could build one yourself. And Sir Edgar Speyer, who we've just seen in relation to his Grosvenor Street house, he had this, what he called an Elizabethan cottage. It's rather a large cottage. He had it built on the North Norfolk coast. North, not so easy to say. The north coast of Norfolk. He had this built, and he used to go up there, and again they would hold concerts there for people in the village and elsewhere. It's now a hotel, and this is my photograph from when I stayed there for a night a couple of years ago. Now, in a way, everything I've said up until now could suggest to you that these were just incredibly rich people, but not necessarily particularly cultured. And one of the things that they really had to fight against, like all new money has to fight against all the time, is the idea that they're just rich and they haven't got anything more than their commercial interests to go with it. But one of the things I really wanted to draw out in the book was just what a strongly cultured group, a sophisticated group of individuals these were. And I think that that comes very specifically from their Jewish upbringing in Germany in the 19th century. And I'll just explain that a little bit more before I go on. Um, Jewish emancipation in Germany during the 19th century was very different from other places, like, for example, in France. In France, after the revolution, all citizens of all faiths and none had been told you have a right to full citizenship, irrespective of your ethnic belonging or anything else. You are citizens of the Republic, and therefore you have full rights. In Germany, which of course didn't even exist as a unified country until 1871, the prospect of emancipation, the prospect of civil rights was offered to the Jewish community more as a reward for becoming German. And the idea of becoming German was that you would become cultured, you'd become sophisticated with reference to European high art, European philosophy, German thinking, German literature. And so Jews during the 19th century were remodeled and saw themselves very actively as Germans of the Jewish faith, but Germans with a very high cultural aspiration. And so this sophistication, this Bildung, as it was called, is one of the defining factors, the defining characteristics in that German Jewish identity, which then they brought over to Britain and found in many respects to be quite different from the upper class British world into which they were coming. And the way I really tried to draw this out in the book is by showing the extraordinary quality of the art collections that they put together when they came over here. And I'm going to start with this, which is from the Mond collection, the Mond crucifixion, now one of the jewels in the National Gallery here in London, because Ludwig Mond bequeathed this and 41 other of his works to the National Gallery on his death. And it shows, I mean, when you go to the Sainsbury wing today, now it's been opened again after its long restoration, you can look down through the Sainsbury wing, and this enormous altarpiece stands out as one of the absolute jewels of the National Gallery collection, as indeed many of the other works which Ludwig Mond had also are. And one of the interesting factors in the collections, which certainly some of the German Jewish collectors put together, when they were Renaissance collections, they often had very strong Christian themes to them. And for the Mond family, as for some of the others, that really wouldn't have been much of an issue because they weren't practicing or observant Jews. But for the Hirsch family, who Matilda and Leopold Hirsch, who we saw earlier, they were observant Jews. They were members of the West London Synagogue, and they had this very large, sort of 10-foot by 10-foot Botticelli altarpiece in their house. And they had many other Christian works of quite militant Christian iconography. And so one of the questions that I wanted to raise in the book was, would this have been problematic? Would it have been considered strange to have this overt Christian iconography in what was a practicing Jewish household? And it seems that even though they were, according to the family, I know the granddaughter, and she says it was known in the family that Matilda Hirsch was very much a devout Jewess, even though they had that religious tradition still in play, they don't seem to have minded having these Christian themed paintings, even at this extraordinary size. I mean, I think it would be an out of the ordinary thing for anybody, really, any family to have a 10 by 10-foot altarpiece in their home. But it was one of the things I wanted to draw out because I think in other studies you can read that, for example, the Rothschilds tended to shy away in their collecting from having Christian themes. But it wasn't all Renaissance by any means. A lot of the collectors had a particular predilection for the Dutch Golden Age, so 17th century Dutch and Flemish painting. And this is one of the highlights now in the National Gallery of Ireland, which came from the Bite collection, this glorious Vermeer. And again, it's a wonderful recognition of how higher quality their collections had when you see the places where the paintings and the other artworks have ended up, national galleries across the world, and some of the other most illustrious museums and galleries. Um, the Bites also had four Rembrandts. This one is now in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. And you may know that the fate of Rembrandt's paintings has sort of seesawed over the last few decades. This one had been downgraded to be a studio work rather than being by Rembrandt himself. It's only recently that the dendrochronological evidence has shown that it is actually probably by Rembrandt. Whereas this work, which was in the Sigismund Neumann collection, has had a rather different fate. It was the centerpiece, another Rembrandt, as they thought, centerpiece of their collection in their house in Piccadilly, until this piece, which is very, very similar, turned up in Berlin and was pronounced to be the original. So the Neumann piece was downgraded to being a studio work, whereas the original Rembrandt was then sold across the Atlantic and is now in the Art Institute of Chicago. And again, beyond the Dutch, beyond the Renaissance, they had some of the most important works from later centuries. This Tiepolo ceiling piece was in the Bischofsheim collection. Again, they had a stupendous house in Mayfair in South Audley Street. And this was the ceiling centerpiece in the Blue Drawing Room, one of the grand reception rooms they had there. And it's now the most important Tiepolo painting in Britain. And again, if you go to the National Gallery in London and you walk through into the 18th century as part of the gallery, you can see it in full pride of place on the wall at the end of one of those corridors. They also, the German Jewish collectors also were aware that they were coming to a country where there'd been a tradition of portrait painting. And the Cassel collection, Sir Ernest Cassel, who's the one on the front cover of the book, he had a grand house in Park Lane with a dining room which could seat 100 people for dinner. And when you went into his dining room, there were four full-length Van Dycks on the walls to just give you that sense that you'd come into somewhere special, including this one of the two Stuart brothers, which again is in the National Gallery in London. But really, it was the 18th century British portraits which caught the eye and caught the imagination of the German Jewish collectors, Reynolds, Romney, Raeburn, and the works of Sir Thomas Lawrence, like this one from the Ludwig Neumann collection, now in the Met, New York, which was really one of the highlights of the J. Pierpont Morgan collection when he bought it of Ludwig Neumann, and it's now actually one of the highlights of the Met collection if you go and visit there. But it wasn't even just paintings that they collected. The Speyer household, which I talked about earlier, with its sort of fantasy rooms, some of them from the Gothic era, some of them from the Renaissance, it was filled with early tapestries, including this early 16th century Gothic reproduction of the story of Perseus and Andromeda, which is now in the Cleveland Museum. Um, some of them had quite extensive antiquities collections. This is a small bronze of Mercury from the first century in Rome, which is now in Princeton and was in the Oppenheimer collection. But actually, the Oppenheimer collection itself was most well known for the drawings that it had, a lot of Renaissance drawings, including this lovely Dura stag beetle that's now in Los Angeles at the Getty Museum. And then they had a lot of Maiolica and other ceramics. It's worth just sort of pointing out that these were not the most obvious, the most colorful ones. the types of works that a lot of these collectors really wanted were the rare, historically important works, like this very early Maiolica pharmacy jar from 15th century Florence, which again was in the Beit collection. And similarly, from the Rosenheim collection, this set of drawing instruments in their original gilt brass case, which is now one of the prized possessions of the British Museum. It belonged, it was sorry, made to begin with by Bartholomew Newsom, who was the clockmaker by appointment to Queen Elizabeth I. So this is a very early full set of Tudor drawing instruments in their original case. And this speaks again to these collectors as being connoisseurs. These were not just people who, as some of them have been caricatured in the past, who just had lots of money and knew what they wanted to buy because people had told them. These were really sophisticated collectors who went after these treasures for themselves and really, threw themselves into collecting and into learning about what they had. Although, having said that, there were also some very exuberant works. These were 18th century French vases, a pair of vases, which came up for auction actually only in July last year and therefore couldn't make it into the books. It was already being printed at that time. But these are blue porcelain from China, from the Qing dynasty, with French ormolu statuary superimposed onto it, showing Leda and the Swan. So you get the sense that as well as the serious stuff, there was also some very glamorous stuff as well. And in a way, I've given you a whistle-stop tour of the sorts of things they did collect. It's worth also just asking the question what they didn't collect. And one of the things they didn't collect was modern art. And so I've thrown up this picture of the Klimt portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, which is quite famous for having been the object of a restitution claim as having been looted by the Nazis. And indeed, it's the subject of that film with Helen Mirren, the Woman in Gold. I put it up there because it's often been said that Jewish collectors of the time, particularly German Jewish collectors, were known as the pioneers, the vanguard of collecting modern art, particularly Impressionist, post-Impressionist art. And indeed, in Vienna, in Berlin, they absolutely were. A lot of the first collections of new art were put together by Jews in those cities. But it's dangerous to extrapolate from that to say that all Jewish collectors were therefore going to be hyper-modernists. And indeed, at the time, of course, that was quite a dangerous trope because being identified as a hyper-modernist could often get you into trouble in those countries. And similarly, the other thing that they didn't collect by and large was Judaica. And this distinguishes them from the Anglo-Jewish families of the elite here at the time who did collect Judaica and Hebraica and were much more in touch with their Jewish identity in that particular way. This is an 18th century Esther scroll, which actually was part of a collection of Solomon Schloss, who was a middle class German Jew who came over to Britain. But that's very much not what these very ultra rich German Jewish magnates were collecting. That doesn't mean, though, that they were unconscious of their Jewish identity and their Jewish roots. It's just that they expressed their Jewishness in very different ways, and in particular through their philanthropy. And I'm showing here the what still exists, the soup kitchen for the Jewish poor. The building still exists. This was one of the primary outlets for philanthropy from the Jewish Board of Guardians in the East End of London. And it was one of the charities that many of the Jewish magnates would support. Similarly, they supported the appeals on behalf of Russian Jews who were facing persecution from the Tsars in that time. So they had a Jewish identity and they knew very much that they'd come from a Jewish background, even though religiously they weren't Jewish very much. And indeed, over time, they moved away from their Jewish roots. And certainly by the next generation, you'll find that very few of them were practicing Jews. Many of them had married out. And really, by the next generations on, you're beginning to see a dilution of any Jewish identity in the family descendants. Part of the problem, which I alluded to earlier, was that some of their philanthropy was directed towards colonial projects. And this is the front, the grand entrance at Imperial College in London to the Royal School of Mines, which was founded by Alfred Beit and Sir Julius Werner. And you see them on either side of the grand entrance here, as it still is today. And Alfred Beit in particular was a great friend of Cecil Rhodes and therefore has come under question in recent years. Imperial College was challenged 5 years ago to actually remove all signs of the Beit family because of the fact that they were so involved with British colonialism at that time. And it's a reminder, I think, that even though they were German Jews by birth, they did get very mixed up with the imperial project of the British Empire, and that hasn't actually always done their reputation very much good in the long term. In respect of their cultural patronage, however, that's been fine. And there are lots of instances of how they supported new museums, new galleries in Britain at that time, including the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which of course was right in the centre of the East End, of the Jewish East End, the home to many of the newcomers from Central and Eastern Europe in those years. And it was Sir Edgar Speyer who put up the money, which really kept the art gallery going for the first 15 years of its existence, and also drew in lots of other money from other German Jewish donors at the same time. Similarly, the National Art Collections Fund was founded in 1903 in order to try to raise money for more works to be bought for British museums, but also to keep some of the key treasures in this country when they were in danger of being lost overseas. And this, the Diego Velázquez's Rugby Venus, which is the only female nude painted by Velázquez, the reason that it kept in this country and the reason that you can now see that in the National Gallery rather than having to travel to the USA is because it was saved for the nation by Ludwig Mond, Edgar Speyer, and particularly at the last minute by Lord Michelham, Sir Herbert Stern. So again, you've got this fascinating view of these German Jews becoming the chief patrons, the chief givers towards nation building through art. And the next time you're traveling on a bus around Hyde Park Corner in London, do look up above the top of the Wellington Arch to that grand bronze group of it's the figure of peace descending on the quadriga of war. And that again was paid for in its entirety by Lord Michelham as a tribute to Edward VII just after his death. So again, whenever you look around London, you've got all these monuments to what the German Jews left in terms of culture, not just in terms of art, but music. When Covent Garden, the Royal Opera House, was in financial difficulties right at the end of the 19th century, who came to its rescue? It's the same names: Neumann, Meyer, Cassel, Bischofsheim. All of these are the ones who put the money up in order to refloat it. Even the BBC Proms was going under in 1902, and Sir Edgar Speyer was the one who came forward with the money to keep it going. And even on the south bank of the Thames, a building which obviously comes from much later, the National Theatre, in its brutalist architecture by Denis Lasdun, the money for this was put up by Sir Karl Mayr and Lady Mayr right back at the time before the First World War, when they committed £70,000, which is, many tens of millions of pounds in today's money, as the seed funding for a national theatre. So even though it took all of those years to come to fruition, it was very much their baby. So the question, which I want to sort of conclude with, is if this group of individuals, this group of families had such an important presence and profile in the Edwardian years, how is it that they have disappeared from the historical record in the intervening century? And the first answer to that, and the reason why I've got this nice banner from the Ferrens Art Gallery in Hull up here, the first answer I think is a fairly immediate answer, in that they didn't leave any monuments with their names attached. So why do we know the name of Thomas Ferrens in Hull? Because he left an art gallery. Why do we know the name of Henry Clay Frick? Because in New York there is a Frick Gallery. Isabella Stewart Gardner in Boston, or indeed the Wallace Collection in London. You know the names of these people because they left a monument, an eponymous monument, which has actually kept their name alive. And in London, certainly, where all of these men lived, the nearest we got to that was Ludwig Mond when he gave his bequests to the National Gallery. He created a Mond room at the same time with money that he'd left. And in the first 15 years, his paintings were all shown together, as you can see here, in their own room as the Mond bequest. But in the 1930s, a young director called Kenneth Clark, who you may know from the series of Civilization, he came in and said, no, no, we don't want to keep all these things together. And so the collection was split up. And instead, they had this little sign on the wall saying, you know, this room was paid for by the bequest, as were all of these 42 paintings part of the bequest. It's just now that they're spread across the whole of the gallery. And I'm afraid I went back there the other day, and even this sign has been taken down. So I'm glad I took a photograph of it when I visited some years ago, because even now you go in and there's no sign telling you why it's called the Mond Room and what the significance of that bequest was. The only place, the only gallery which does have the name of one of the German Jewish magnates on it is in Cape Town, South Africa, and it's the Michaelis collection in what's called the Old Townhouse in Cape Town. And you can see it here. But this also has had a difficult history. It's actually been closed for the last 10 years, partly also because it doesn't really chime this collection of Flemish and Dutch art, which was specifically set up in order to celebrate the European presence in South Africa, the white European presence. It doesn't chime really with the decolonization agenda, which is much more prevalent now. But I'm happy to say, right at the end of last year, the collection did open again, and you can see here one of the first pictures from inside, which gives you a sense of the splendor of the collection that was given there. And just a final couple of thoughts. Okay, maybe they didn't leave monuments with their names on, but there could have been other reasons as well why it wasn't particularly appropriate or felt to be particularly appropriate to be remembering the contribution made by German Jews, particularly in the aftermath of the First World War. And here it was very much their German identity which got them into trouble. There was a strong anti-German feeling in the build-up to the war, certainly, of course, during the war, with all the losses that were sustained, and then after the war as well. There was no appetite to celebrate what Germans had contributed to British culture, and that could well be another reason why their contribution has been written out of history. And similarly, it may be also that there was a latent feeling that you didn't want to celebrate a Jewish contribution. And I'll be interested if people pick up on that in the Q&A. I'm showing you here, on the other hand, a picture from the Waddesdon bequest in the British Museum, which was given by Ferdinand de Rothschild, the Austrian Jewish Ferdinand de Rothschild, who came over to Britain at the same time as the ones I've written about. And in this case, his Jewish identity has been preserved, and indeed his name has been preserved, as it had at Wadston Manor itself, the National Trust property, which has sustained so much of the other collection in it. So there is still that question mark as to whether or not the Jewish identity and the German identity has sort of held back any sense of their being preserved for posterity. The only place where you can still go and see roughly what some of these things would have looked like in their domestic environment is actually across the water in Ireland. Outside Dublin, Rusborough House is where some of the Bite collection has ended up, and I thoroughly recommend if you find yourself in Dublin, take the bus out to Rusborough. It's a wonderful Georgian house and a super location, and you get to understand what this type of collection would have looked like in its original setting when people were living alongside it. So that is my attempt to restore some of the reputation, some of the historical record, which has been lost in the intervening 100 years. And as I said at the beginning, it really was a labor of love doing that research, finding out from some of the descendants of the families who still live in Britain, but very seldom have the same names anymore, and working with them to try and restore that sense of the patronage that that these German Jews practiced in Britain, the philanthropy they practiced, and also the sophisticated art collections that they put together. Because I think more than anything else, my chief aim was to try and push back against the idea that these collections, these treasures, were just the trophies of the super rich. I think it's very easy in generation after generation, we have that prejudice against the super rich. While I have no particular desire to defend enormous wealth, I did think in the case of these German Jews, they brought something more than just that commercial savvy. They also brought a strong cultural sophistication with them as well. So that's really part of the story I wanted to draw out. Um, but I'm going to stop here and stop sharing. So I think that we can now move over to any questions or indeed thoughts or comments
Yes.
people might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. If anybody has questions or any comments, pop them in the Q&A in the few minutes we've got left. Um, what I particularly enjoyed, John, about your presentation, having read the book, is you actually weren't just presenting the book, you presented in a different order. And so anybody that's listened to this and actually buys the book will still get an awful lot out of it. You haven't spoiled it, I suppose, by sharing what you've done over the last 40 minutes or so. Was there something specific that motivated you to write this book?
Yes, I mean, it came really from a book which I'd done earlier, which in fact, you mentioned, Jonathan, right at the beginning. My mother's family had originally been German Jewish and had come over to Britain at the same time as the ones I've written about here. And so I researched them. They're the Messel family of Nymans. And if anybody is interested in gardening, you may have visited Nymans as the sort of National Trust property down in West Sussex. It's got a great garden and a ruined house there. And when I was doing the research into my mother's family and their trajectory from being German Jews and gradually becoming more and more English as the and also Christian as the 20th century moved on, I realized that there were these other families who'd come at the same time who even more exemplified that trajectory and had this extraordinary sense of their cultural presence in Britain. And so it became astonishing to me that their story hadn't been written up, hadn't really come to the fore. And so I saw it almost as a pleasurable duty to try and follow that up. And I must say it was fascinating to do the research, to rebuild, to reconstruct their collections from nothing, and to see just the level of the philanthropy and the cultural patronage. I mean, I haven't had time to go into the philanthropy, but they were the equivalent of today's billionaires, but they were giving absolutely vast sums to medical, to educational, to other types of charitable causes, at a time when I don't think British aristocracy in any way was doing the same thing. I think perhaps new money in Britain was more willing to give to local municipal causes, but they were extraordinary in that respect.
So in a sense, the book you wrote about the Messel family perhaps served as a blueprint for this one.
It was the inspiration for it.
Mm,
It was a bit easier because I suppose we had access to a lot more of the family records for that. Whereas with these ones, sometimes there's very good records, and sometimes you're really scrabbling to try and find
mm.
out if there are any archives which still exist.
Were there any particular challenges in research or any surprises in your research?
I mean, to be honest, the really great surprises was how interested the descendants were in seeing their ancestors being drawn out into the public domain. I mean, they were all of them, without exception, incredibly generous to me. Showed me the unpublished inventories, shared with me some of the notebooks, the diaries, and things like that. And really, that's what enabled me to get an insight into what made these people tick. Sometimes some very candid um, things that they wrote about their experiences in the First World War, how difficult it was for them to be Germans in Britain, even though they declared their allegiance, their loyalty to the king and country here. They were still obviously known to be German, and they had relatives still in Germany, sometimes fighting in the German army against their own children in the British army. So it was a very, very difficult time, and that comes out very strongly in these sort of personal accounts, the personal diaries and letters that they left behind.
We have a question from Yvonne Cheney. Yvonne is in Southern California, but she mentioned in comments earlier that she grew up near the Whitechapel Art Gallery
Ah.
that you pictured, and the I think the soup kitchen. Um, she says that I think this is a very important book in the environment we're living in at present. Did you have a problem printing the book because of the subject?
No problem at all in that respect. It's Yale University Press who've done it, and I must say they were magnificent in terms of putting the book together and making it into a visually very, very attractive thing. The only actual problem was nothing to do with the German or the Jewish or any of that identity. It was printed in China, and where Yale University Press now print their books. And you have to be very careful to make sure that there's nothing in it which could be considered to be challenging to the Chinese regime. I mean, obviously, there's nothing in this because it's talking about a completely different time. But no, I mean, there hasn't been any consideration in that respect now.
There are probably very few pages in this book that don't have a color plate or an image. Um, how much of that imagery existed already, and how much of it did you actually have to commission or go out and take yourself?
Most of it existed. There was I mean, some of the things I took myself. For example, some of the mausoleums which exists again, which nobody had really looked at, where at the end of their lives, these magnates had these extraordinary graves, big, great tombs in some of the both Jewish and non-Jewish cemeteries. So I took the photographs of those. But by and large, what was fascinating is that the artworks after their deaths were sold off. Usually they were sold off, and that meant that they went across the Atlantic often because at that time it was American collectors who had the money, and the American collectors, by and large, left them to local museums. So you suddenly find that in Indianapolis or in Columbus, Ohio, or in obviously Washington, D.C., and places like that, or Los Angeles, you get these fantastic paintings and other artworks which have come from there. And yes, you have to pay sometimes to get the rights to reproduce them. But by and large, those images did exist.
Jeffrey Alderman asks, how many of these German Jewish collectors who settled in the UK actually obtained UK naturalization?
All of them. I
Mm,
mean, I think that's a very good question, and I think it really shows that when they came, their intention was to stay and to have this as their new identity. One very interesting one who isn't featured as a specific case study in the book, but came over a little bit in advance, is a guy called Edward Speyer, who's the cousin of Sir Edgar Speyer, who I looked at. And his experience, he wrote a very good account of this, was fascinating, I thought, because he said he'd come over to Britain first for the economic opportunity it offered, and then he went back to Frankfurt where he intended to live. But this was after the establishment of the unified German Reich under Prussian control under Bismarck. And he found that the atmosphere which had been created was so authoritarian. I mean, it really, he said, it was like a police state. And when you lived in Britain, where the state didn't have that same reach into people's lives, he said you simply couldn't make the transition back. So even though he had intended to go and live in Frankfurt for the rest of his life, he came back to London and actually spent the rest of his life living in Britain, simply because he found that the liberal atmosphere was much more to his taste. And that's something you come across again and again and again in the memoirs. You know, whatever levels of prejudice still existed, the state didn't have that reach into your life. And also, there wasn't this open, what they call Jew baiting, in a lot of the German press at the time. So there was a palpable difference there.
do you think there's a case for people like Edgar Speyer? You mentioned him, his cousin. Um, I mean, he pretty much financed the London Underground, and he's not recognised for it. Do you think there's a job to do in terms of some of these people?
I think so, and I think it's becoming more known that there is a sort of an injustice that's been leveled against them. I mean, in his case, he was drummed out of Britain in
Mm,
1915 because he was considered to be too pro-German, and he had obviously continued. His brother lived in America and ran the US arm of the bank and was profoundly and openly pro-German in the war. They
mm,
also had the connection still in Germany itself. And at the beginning of the First World War, one of the things which a lot of Germans living in Britain, including the German Jews, they were asked to write loyalty letters to the Times. And so you can see them in in May, I think it was 1915, you begin to see all these loyalty letters coming up, saying, you know, I was born German, but I absolutely declare my loyalty to king and country and deplore the way in which the Germans are now
mm,
prosecuting the war. And Sir Edgar Speyer didn't write one of those. He said, you know, I exactly as you say, I funded the London Underground. I funded Captain Scott's trip to the Antarctica. I'm a member of the Privy Council. I'm a great friend of Lloyd George. Why on earth should I be writing these letters in defense of myself? And that went down incredibly badly. So he
mm.
was actually drummed out of Britain and never actually came back for the rest of his life.
Alan Munn asks, did any of these German Jewish collectors have any interest in Northern art?
They did, and I know I've sort of in the pieces I've shown today, I've sort of veered a little bit towards the Italian Renaissance, but they definitely had German works, which of course relates to their own background. They also had Meissen porcelain collections as well as that, so they did have a good range. And the Rosenheims were fascinating. They even had a unique collection of German book plates. So the ex libris that you find at the beginning of books, right the way back to the 16th century. So a very arcane, somewhat obscure form of Renaissance collecting, which again I think shows them to have been very sophisticated intellectual collectors. And that again pushes back against the stereotype of new money, perhaps just being interested in these things as trophies. I just don't think that that was true.
Mm. So you've got two glossy coffee table books under your belt. What's next?
I must say, I do find it fascinating trying to tease out this stories of some of these individuals who have been a rather lost to history or sometimes been rather unfairly treated. Um, so yes, I'd be interested to see if I can maybe tease out some more of them. And maybe it doesn't have to be from the same community. There are others, again, the Ionides community, Ionides family, who were Greek in origin, came to Britain at the same time. And if you go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, there's an entire wing of the V&A, which is entirely made up of their collection. And again, they've passed out of history. So there's quite a lot of these individuals who you could feel, yeah, it's quite interesting to just sort of tease out why they came to Britain, what reaction they had from people living here, and then what they left as well. Because, in a sense, the underlying theme, which I think is a very positive one at the moment, is to say that immigrant communities, I mean, the whole of Britain, we are an immigrant country. Depending on what generation you came in, there has been this extraordinary contribution to our shared heritage, the richness of what we enjoy, both in terms of the cultural and in terms of a lot of the educational privileges that we have here. And so I think that's a positive message in the present era to just pull out and say, do you know what? Britain has absolutely benefited from the multiculturalism that has existed through the centuries here. And let's not forget that.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for being our guest. This book is available at all good bookshops. It really is good value for money. There's a lot in it. And to say thank you, I'll send you some of my pictures. This is some black and white photographs of the diversity of Israeli citizens, which I hope you'll enjoy having a leaf through. Now, just a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. So next Monday, we welcome Daniel Rachel. He's discussing his book with me, This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika and the Third Reich. And this book exposes the history of the use of Nazi symbols in popular music culture. And we then have a little break until the 1st of June. Douglas Century will be with us, then speaking about his book, Crash of the Heavens. This is the remarkable story of Hannah Senesh, the only military mission to rescue Europe's Jews during World War II. To book, please visit milim.org.uk. You can sign up to our newsletter there and make sure you don't miss anything. All these online events are free, but if you do want to make a donation to help us with the cost of our programming, there is a link in the chat, or you'll find it on our website. And it being our 10th anniversary, we are hoping to raise £10,000 this year, sorry, £5,000 this year, 10th anniversary, to help fund our future programme. Please do give generously. So it remains for me to thank our guest, John Hilary, once again. Thank you so much, John. It's been a real joy.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all next time. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.